Come to us from the physics department, where she's been doing some amazing work transforming large lecture theatres to ones of smaller spaces and studio learning. So we're really looking forward to hearing your talk, Katie, and I hand the floor over to you.
Yes, so with the next 35-40 minutes, I'll talk to you a little bit about why, which I won't spend too much time on, because obviously at the business school you moved to a similar mode years ago, and kind of we visited your TBL spaces and talked to some business lecturers when we were preparing to do this, but mostly how we've changed the Stage 1 Advancing Physics 1 and 2 courses into this studio format. So I got my PhD at North Carolina State University, where my advisor developed something called Scale-Up in the mid-1990s, which currently stands for Student-Centered Active Learning Environment with Upside-Down Pedagogies. So it evolved through the ages. Before it was for just large enrollment classes, just university physics, but now it's spread to a variety of disciplines, a variety of class sizes, and things like that. But this heavily influenced, obviously, what I brought here, so I'll kind of introduce that as a way to provide some context. Also, technical difficulties interfered with some of our lab collection, or data collections, so I'll at least show you some data from that. And then most of the talk, I'll talk about what we've specifically done at University of Auckland to make it unique. So, how did you learn physics or business or engineering, whatever discipline you're from? I'm sure you've sat in a classroom somewhat like this. Have you ever wondered where that format came from? Its roots actually date back to about 1000 AD, where Pope Gregory wanted to get his message out in a consistent manner to his expanding empire. So the printing press wouldn't be invented for another 500 years, but the kingdom was filled with monasteries, which had auditorium spaces, and coincidentally, these monks were great at copying. So what they do is hire a lecturer, which literally translates as reader. The lecturer would read a manuscript, and the monks would copy it down word for word. So by the time the lecture was done, each monk would have his handwritten copy of the manuscript, and they could hire themselves out as lecturers around the kingdom. So this was excellent technology for the time, but 1,000 years later, we're doing the same thing. Not only do we have access to printing presses and books, but we can access entire libraries of information from the convenience of our smartphone in our pocket. So obviously, this has profound implications for our role as educators. This chancellor of the University of Minnesota said that colleges and universities need to start thinking about education not as the pursuit of knowledge in distinct disciplines, but as the acquisition of skills necessary to succeed in a world where knowledge is always changing. So I think the drafting of the revised University of Auckland graduate profile reflects this change as well. The draft of this profile includes things like getting our students ready to meet the needs of employers, so to have a functional understanding of the content where they can apply it to the workplace, using scientific principles to analyze or solve complex problems, having some creativity in solution seeking, work collaboratively and constructively with others, being able to have the self-discipline to work independently and achieve goals, and participate in a community and engage in public discourse. So these are all things that we have to start incorporating in our courses. I also just recently finished this book, Humans Are Underrepresented, What High Achievers Know That Brilliant Machines Never Will. Certainly in physics, a lot of people think physics is about doing math, but however good you are at doing math, a computer can do it faster and more correct than you can. So essentially, this book argues that the skills for the future are more people skills, like emphasizing, collaborating, creating, leading, and building relationships. So there is this big emphasis to get students prepared to be in high-need STEM fields, but even students in high-need STEM fields need skills like this, not just number crunching. So Scale Up, the ideas behind it started when my advisor was on teaching an interdisciplinary course as part of a NSF grant, and he worked with people in engineering and mathematics to teach a small class of 30 students, but highly interdisciplinary, extremely hands-on, using all the best active pedagogies that were research-based. And this class was enormously fun to teach. The instructors were learning from each other, kind of creating this amazing synergy. And the students were learning a lot and super engaged. But he knew it would never be sustained. It required an enormous amount of resources, and only 30 students were benefiting. So what his challenge was, how can we scale up these best pedagogical practices to large enrollment university physics courses? So in a traditional physics environment, you can lecture to hundreds of students at a time. But where it becomes more expensive is having the space and the GTAs for smaller sections of maybe 30 students in the labs and tutorials. So he thought, well, why don't we make these labs and tutorials a little bigger, the lectures a little smaller, have it all in the same space, have about 100 students, a lecturer or GTA meeting for the same amount of time, and integrating the lab, lecture, and tutorial sections of the course together. So this is certainly a common complaint about traditional physics courses, and when I taught the lecture in the traditional physics course, it was hard to know what was going on in lab, what was going on in tutorial. If you skip a day, everything's off sync. It's not very coordinated, but this makes going from theory to practice to discussion, a kind of seamless transition. And once you build the classroom, it's as cheap, if not cheaper, as the traditional model. So he evaluated the classroom design and intentionally chose to design things that would emphasize the students' learning over the professor's lecturing. And this is kind of the design principles we used here. So essentially you have 3 teams of 3 students per team sitting at a table. We did various experiments and found that about 2.2 meters was big enough that they could do activities and experiments at the table, but they weren't shouting to be heard. There's plenty of space for the instructor to walk between tables to engage students in conversations and ask them questions. And at University of Auckland, like the TDL spaces, we kind of purposefully angled the instructor podium and put it off in the corner so the instructors wouldn't be tempted to hide behind it, but instead get out and engage with the class. So some of these studio spaces can be very fancy. Massachusetts Institute of Technology uses it to teach all their physics courses, so they've got the latest technology, but talking to the instructors, the most important piece of technology is the whiteboards on the wall. These serve as public thinking spaces, so students can all work together on a solution, offer feedback, and contribute to the discussion because they all can see what's going on. As an instructor, it makes it really easy for you to roam around the classroom, see the progress of the student groups, maybe some common mistakes, or if everyone's stuck, you can call the class together and address that. Also, sometimes students are nervous to write something down that they think might be wrong because they don't want a big scribble in their beautiful notebooks. But with the whiteboard, you can just erase and try a different approach. So it encourages some intellectual risk-taking. We also give each of our students name tags, and we go out of our way to address them by name. This creates a sense of community in these large university classes where students could just feel like a number. So the typical class really depends on the topic for the day, but essentially it's kind of a flipped classroom approach where the students read the textbook and maybe watch some short videos before class. They take a pre-flight quiz, and then we spend class time refining those ideas and applying them to different situations. So the instructor is supposed to minimize lecture and use it primarily for organization and motivation. And most of the class time is spent cycling between clicker questions to test content, activities, and follow-up discussion, with the instructor providing the perspective to highlight important ideas and create the connections between yesterday's material and maybe tomorrow's. So here we meet for 3 2-hour sessions per week, same amount of contact hours as a traditional model, but there's no lecture day, lab day. It's just depending on what's in the content, we do that. So there are some secrets to making this work. Just creating this classroom isn't enough to get those learning gains. We're very strategic about how we structure groups. So we use some kind of incoming measure of ability to distribute our superstars, 1 per table. And then the team of 3 is mixed ability, which the research has shown mixed ability teams can come up with better solutions than just a team of 3 of your top students. In the first grouping, we try to pair students who might be underrepresented in physics, so the Maori, Pacifica, and female students. But we've found that once they find their voice, they're usually comfortable contributing for subsequent groupings. So we recognize students are different. Some students might be lazy and avoid work. So each team has to come up with a group contract that they all have to sign together. Some of our groups prescribe star jumps and push-ups if their teammates are late. And so this encourages people to fulfill their responsibilities to the team. At NC State, we also offered a teamsmanship bonus where every team who averaged above an 80 on a test, these were mixed ability teams, would get 5 bonus points. So this encourages the top students to slow down and make sure the other students are understanding and following along so they can all do well in the test and they can all get the bonus. Johnson & Johnson have 5 keys to productive collaborative learning, and we kind of try to fulfill all of these in scale-up classrooms. Obviously, the round tables and the whiteboards help promote face-to-face interaction. There's multiple ways we have individual accountability. Still, 50% of the course grade is individual exams and mid-semester tests. And each week we have a weekly quiz where the students, this was actually requested at NC State, students would tend to overestimate their individual abilities because everything was so easy when they were solving it in their teams, and because these team bonds became so strong, they'd often attempt their homework together and study together outside of class, but then they sat down at the test and they're like, oh no, this is a little harder when my teammates aren't here. So each week we have a weekly quiz which they first attempt alone, and then if they don't get it right, they can consult with their teammates for up to 75% of the points. So this gives them an individual check-in each week to figure out their own understanding if they can do it by themselves. But by the time the quiz is done, hopefully they talk to their teammates, everyone knows how to do a question like that might come up on a test or a quiz. So that's one example of positive interdependence, working together to get these 75% of the points if they don't get it independently. We also give them group roles and have various assignments where they have to talk about how they each contributed. At the beginning of the semester, we make them watch videos about productive groups working together, unproductive groups working together, and talk about how you can contribute productively to a group. And then we also have them reflect on their behavior in the group. One way we do that is the teammates evaluation, so they provide feedback, which the teammates see anonymously moving forward. So, did it work? Most of this data is from NC State, because our data, as I say, had some issues. But here, a lecturer came up with an open-ended, I think this was a mid-semester test that he gave to his students and the scale-up students. You can see that the scale-up students scored a whole letter grade better and did better on every question except for number 9. The reason number 9 has an asterisk is it covered materials that the scale-up students haven't seen yet. So one of our goals for our students is for them to be able to tackle unfamiliar problems and unfamiliar content. So you can see that they did pretty well considering. This next chart is very intimidating, so I'll take a moment to orient you to the axis. First, on the y-axis, we have normalized gain. So that's like the percentage of possible progress based on your pretest score. Then on the horizontal axis, we have various concept inventories administered in both the mechanics and electricity and magnetism semester of the course at various institutions around the US. And then we're going to further subdivide those results into BMT, bottom, middle, and top third of the students grouped by their conceptual pretest score. So you can see that the scale-up students outperformed the lecture students in every single category. And one interesting thing to notice is the top students are gaining the most from this approach. So as you probably noticed the first time you taught a course, is that you really understand something when you have to explain it to someone else. So we believe that the top students are furthering their own refining their own understanding by explaining these concepts to others. Finally, at NC State, our failure rates were cut by a factor of 3 overall, and by a factor of 4 for African American students, and by a factor of 5 for female students. So that was pretty impressive as well. So now, University of Auckland, we actually redesigned our first year laboratories, which look pretty cramped, and we were able to reuse the wooden tops that are at least 50 years old and actually turn them into round tables, which was pretty cool. That's what the space looks like right now. Then my next big task was to kind of create these interesting activities and this new curriculum. So we try to bring in some real life relevance and have shown them some movie clips, including this heist scene with the Ocean's 11 movie when we talk about lasers. So discussions like this hopefully help them think more critically about the misleading science that sometimes we encounter in our lives or in the media. We also asked the faculty in the department to contribute whiteboard problems that relates to their research. So here's whiteboard problem contributed by the biophotonics group, where it talks about microfluidics. In addition to the full-length labs, which I'll mention in a minute, we try to have smaller hands-on activities. So for example, with this one, students hold a flashlight and they adjust the angle of the cardboard here and see how that affects the shadow area, which gives them a more concrete idea of dot product and flux. On occasion, we even have them undergo some philosophical discussions. So this one has to do with kind of the implications of quantum mechanics. Is this a statement of uncertainty or indeterminacy? So I previewed this slide at a physics faculty meeting, and even the physicists didn't agree on the proper interpretation, generated a lot of heated discussion. So it's pretty fun to give problems to intro students who don't have a right answer or things that normal physicists still grapple with. Certainly with these large classes, we try to harness and use technology to our advantage. The PhET simulations are a great way to do some virtual labs. And we have the Lablet, which is a way to videotape data and do some graphical analysis and motion analysis that was developed in the department. So we wanted to use this to our advantage when we were doing our labs. Certainly one of my biggest challenges is how can we plan labs for 125 students to do at one time? So my goal was to maximize the use of technology. This Lablet, because it's on a tablet, it's more familiar technology than kind of the Pasco black boxes, which serve one purpose and no one knows how they work really. And it's a versatile tool, so we used it in almost every one of these experiments. So it's good to get them using the same thing multiple times. Wanted simple equipment that ideally was cheap to buy and easy to store, and then we wanted more open-ended experiments so that it would build some of those soft skills related to designing and executing experiments, not just following those cookbook exercises. So the first one, and we also had them write one-page argument-based reports to build some scientific writing skills and, once again, more critical thinking, evaluation type stuff. So their first experiment, they dropped muffin wrappers. They don't have American basket-style coffee filters here, so I had to do a cultural adjustment. And they had to argue whether that was proportional to velocity or velocity squared. They had to design a way to determine the spring constant of a ballistic launcher, determine the wave speed in a slinky, which these weren't 90s kids, so they didn't have slinkies as part of their childhood. This was a good opportunity for them. And then our final experiment was a bit more traditional calorimetry experiment, but we encouraged them to bring in chemistry and their knowledge of properties of metals when they were arguing what the mystery metal was, not just stop when they solve for the specific heat. In 121, this is our electricity and magnetism course. Obviously, those are very abstract phenomena, so we want to help our students visualize these very abstract fields while building the skills of computational physics. So we had a student come up with these tutorial videos, and we had these programming exercises where they can see how numeric integration works to find what the E field of a rod looks like, and even some dynamic, this is a cyclotron motion animation. Before Studio came online, I tried to start getting people thinking about how they were teaching and maybe get some people interested in teaching in the Studio classroom. So we offered a monthly pedagogy workshop for all TAs, and faculty were invited to. Certainly a great part of that was just getting the TAs talking to the instructors and comparing notes with their different grain sizes. So that was something that people enjoyed.
Was that paid?
The TAs did get paid, so, but I think they learned something. The Studio team had much more in-depth training on things like, instead of learning objectives, we call it performance objectives. What do you want the students to do, and how you design your course starting from that perspective, formative and summative assessment, essential elements of successful collaborative learning. We had some people from Student Learning Services come into our training session and talk to us about how we might anticipate dealing with students with special learning needs, which was great. A lot of their strategies, whether or not a student has special learning needs, like enhance just the way you teach in general, and then how to set expectations for students to learn in this different type of way. After this course, students will move more into traditional spaces, but I worked with Stage 2 instructors to advise them how they could have more active pedagogies even within a traditional environment, and we've expanded the amount of tutorial time and problem-solving time in Stage 2 as well. So preliminary results. Obviously, well, any educational data is hard to track exact changes, and made it a little more difficult this time because I redistributed the topics in the two semester course sequence. So we actually moved some trickier topics into the first semester course, and we encouraged our like 30 or 40 of our top students to test directly into 150, so the second semester course. So despite having harder topics and less of our best students, in both these courses we had high attendance. The mid-semester test scores were slightly higher than they were in past years. The student evaluations met the Faculty of Science average, which if you've ever tried to implement these more student-centered techniques, you're asking students to do more work, so the evaluations always tend to go down. So the fact that they're meeting the average actually is a sign of victory. And unfortunately, technology, Qualtrics kind of stripped the student identities when we were collecting the pre-test, so kind of these forced concept inventories, which is the major benchmark we use in physics, because exam test questions, you can never make them exactly the same difficulty. Now we couldn't pair the pre and post, so it lost a lot of the meeting, but hopefully we'll have data for that after next year. Students in the science evaluations and end of semester questionnaires really loved the peer interaction, and they said things like it was the only class that they were able to meet people and make friends that they could study with in other classes. And certainly as an instructor, you saw this spilling over. They were helping each other with math, computer science. Maybe one was better at physics, but somebody else was better at something else. So this was very visible. I enjoyed working in a group. When I didn't know the answer, someone could explain it to me. When someone else didn't know the answer, I was able to cement my own learning by explaining it to them. Studio forced us to think and interact throughout the semester, so there's not such a shock for exam study. And then my favorite is be prepared to be pushed out of your comfort zone. This course can be frustrating, but it'll teach you more than just content. It teaches you how to interact with others and engage in critical thinking. After the exam, we had a little bit of an explosion on Piazza. Some people who thought it was difficult, and I swear I didn't pay the student to write this, but this is one that had taken 120 in the past format, and he says, someone who has taken and survived the old format, I can confirm this is a major improvement on that style. Studio gives you more resources, more time with the TAs and instructors, lets you ask questions as you think of them, and constantly reinforces what the instructors are teaching. It lets you discuss problems with your classmates and provides a solid platform to learn experimental process and communication skills, both of which you will need in future courses, while taking the pressure off when it comes to exam time and giving you room for error in the final exam. So we just need to recruit this guy as advertising. So here's our 120 final exam scores. It's a bit disappointing to me, but essentially the average score was the same as past years, which once again, considering our top students would have gone and the material is harder, that's already an accomplishment. Certainly one thing you can notice is that it's more bimodal than past years, so we have more students in the 75 plus category, but we do have this huge cohort kind of in the 0 to 30%, which is certainly not ideal. We think this comes from the cognitive rehearsal of them explaining the ideas to their peers, so that's promising. We do have suggested prereqs coming into this course, but I think a lot of first years don't have a firm enough foundation, and this class, because it involves so much more independent learning, there's like the physics that you have to learn, but also the study skills. So there are some people who kind of fell off the wagon, and we kind of want to do a better job of properly streaming students in advance to avoid issues like this. But you do see at least some promising results when you compare it to their exam versus coursework. All the people who are doing well on the exam are the ones who are doing well in the coursework. It wasn't that they just didn't show up for class and did awesome on the exam, which I'm sure happened in past years. Some people who didn't do much in class and their exam showed that. Obviously, it's a little more worrying when there's people with high coursework but low final exam scores, but that's something we made changes to hopefully avoid that situation in the future. Interestingly, the pre-flights are the reading quizzes coming before class, and this seemed to have the highest correlation with course performance, even though they were only worth 2% of the course grade. So these are people who are putting in effort to do a little physics every day, reading the textbook, things like this, and it does pay off when it comes to the final exam and the overall coursework. So reflections, moving forward, I do think that proper streaming is pretty essential, and obviously in an environment like this one, if you have somebody who doesn't show up to class or doesn't put any effort in, it has more of a toxic impact than it would in the lecture setting. So that's something that we're gonna encourage moving forward. Because this is a large class, we use Mastering Physics and electronic delivery of homework, weekly quizzes. In 120, a lot of the in-class exercises they also did on Mastering Physics, so they could get a grade. We thought that's the only way that we could motivate them to do the problems in class. But Peter actually had an amazing suggestion. He sat in on one of these courses. One of the complaints with the final exam is that they were different than the Mastering Physics problems. I don't think the content of the questions were that different, but these students are so used to solving problems on a computer screen where it gives them hints and instantaneous feedback. They don't spend time sitting with a blank piece of paper or something like this and just like have that moment like where there's nothing there to help them. So he recommended doing past exam problems as whiteboard problems throughout the semester. This motivates them all to do it even if they don't get points because they know it's getting them ready for the past exams. So I think feedback from the students who did 120 and now are in 121 with that modification, they love having the past exam problems as whiteboard to build their confidence, give them more exposure to doing problems more on paper. So we've already made changes going into the second semester of implementation, and there's things we'll continue to do, but I think it was a pretty solid first effort. Cool. So that's all I have. Plenty of time for questions. I thought I had a question slide, but.
So any questions that we have for Katie today?
The ethics problem that you had, was that actually a result of your ethics application that you wanted the anonymous response, or did the Qualtrics?
I think Qualtrics did something tricky, yeah.
You can grab that, so.
Yeah, I set things up. I got my ethics approved. Alistair from Clear was going to help just pair the responses but remove their identities, but it was some setting in Qualtrics that IT, no one knew this problem existed with Qualtrics, so I guess Alistair now is like one of the university experts in like retaining this information with Qualtrics, but it was just something unusual there.
So this time round, you'll have the ability to do that mapping for this semester?
Hopefully. We only had 1-1 this semester, so we didn't do the force concept inventory because that's more Newton's Laws 120 material. But unfortunately, we had technology issues when we were trying to do the force concept inventory in the traditional class before this, because we did it on Canvas and it actually told them the right answers. And so for a pre-post, you don't want to have them see the right answers after the pre-test. So done this hundreds of times at NC State and never had any of these issues. But was there a hand over here?
It was, yes, sir.
sorry I came in late, so
No worries.
a little bit. It looks incredible, and well done for your hard work. This is not an easy thing. I just had one question that was kind of bugging me a wee bit. You had a slide that was your course concept inventory one, and showing that the top kids have got the most out of all of this. And this is something that worries me because of the bottom kids, and then any changes that mean that the top kids get more. And in my classes, at least, the top kids are the ones that, despite my best efforts, they're still going to learn.
Yeah, exactly.
No matter what I do, they're always going to get loads out of it. And so, do you have any feeling of why that was, and what you might do to change it, and who those people were? Is there a demographic? Is it, I go home, I don't have a computer at home, so I can't practice, or, what is there a thing?
Yeah, so those are good questions. Certainly on that slide, the bottom students are still getting more, compared to the traditional, their learning gains are still like way higher than they would be in a traditional format. So maybe they're not learning the most, but they still are learning a lot more than they would. Obviously, with our data from this semester, when there's that huge tail end, that's when it's way more worrying. So, certainly the way we train people how to work in groups, have group roles, we think the top students are benefiting the most because they're talking and contributing the most, but by creating learning opportunities where everyone can contribute, everyone can talk, even if they're not a top physics math students, they can still contribute and kind of integrate these ideas into their understanding. So that's certainly something that we try to do. As far as who these are, I don't know if I know any socioeconomic studies as far as who learns the most for studio, but that would be
question here, maybe to contribute.
Okay.
Thinking.
Yep, so if you can fast forward to the UOA slide, the grades. If you do have the student identifiers, there's a lot of, there's a way for you to access their social, economic background, their style of school they came from, etc. No, not that one, the one further down, final course grades. Yeah, the one above it.
Oh, yep.
And so that's the first thing, and Steve can help you with that. And secondly is, in my course, what I did was I surfaced this data, similar data, anonymized, just aggregate data, to the next cohort. And I showed them, and the students are actually very intuitive in how they interpret this data. So they can see that, the weaker students, if they know they're in that category, they need to up their game. So it's actually influencing their choices and behaviours, but without you having to do anything active. So that's
we did show certainly the pre-flight grade, because there are a lot of students who think they can skip their reading because it's only worth 2%. So that's something that we brought for discussion. To kind of finish your question, there has been a lot of work with FCI by gender. That's something that I almost did my PhD on. Force concept inventory, these learning gains with gender, and they do find that, there's also studies that say that FCI itself might be gendered, because a lot of cannonballs and hockey pucks and things like this. So somebody changed it to shopping and babies, and then the gender differences went away. Who knows? So right now we are the labs were developed through little seed grants. We're trying to do a seed grant now to change a lot of the whiteboard problems and exercising in class to more just diverse interests. The textbook was extremely Americanized, and it was kind of jarring teaching in this setting and all the British units and things like this. And they do still have all these traditional baseballs and footballs and male-oriented things. So, as well as things like ice, that a lot of people in New Zealand don't encounter ice very often. So we want to change that to water slides and mud slides and, I don't know, more Kiwi-friendly things. So who knows?
I would just add to what Angela was saying in response to Carrie's, is that the other thing that you have to take into account here is the change for the students. You were talking about the change for the TAs, the change for the teaching. And I think within the demographics, you might find that some of these students are coming from secondary schools where they've never experienced this type of learning before. It'd be a really interesting pre-question to ask about their kind of learning experiences that they're bringing into this course. It's very scary. We tried some of this out at Epsom, and some of the feedback that we got from students were along the lines of, once I was able to get over being scared of being wrong in front of others, I felt I was ready to learn. And that can be a huge barrier.
Yes.
And that might be what you're
You're
potentially
right.
seeing
Yeah.
here.
Well, certainly I mean, people are like, oh, I did this at high school. This isn't so different from my high school, things like this. So I haven't heard the other thing, but certainly some students are exposed to things like this, and they said it wasn't hard to get used to the new format, whereas others did say it was very hard to change their way of learning, especially when they spend the rest of their week in very traditional classes.
Even as far as to go and say, sorry, just quickly on the end, are you the only child in your family? Do you have younger siblings? That would be, especially for that small group space, that to me is the place that people get the most experience from working with others is the brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew.
I find this slide quite fascinating. Is it normal in science for over half the students to fail the exam?
Yeah.
We wouldn't pass it. I mean, most of our stage 1 courses have must-pass requirements. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, what does
think
that
the
do?
overall pass rate was about the same
What
as
does-
past years.
What does that do to them psychologically, in a sense,
Right.
to fail the exam?
Yeah.
In science, I think there's a requirement for you to pass the lab separately from the theory, but there's not necessarily in every recourse the requirement to pass the theory independently of the total score. So,
the same.
so some students are very strategic. For example, our final exam was only 40%.
Yeah,
So
we
then-
switched to 40%. It used to be 60.
Yeah, and as soon as some students know, sweet, I can back off a little bit and focus on my other courses. That they choose to do that strategically, and then they just scrape through the exam, but still get an overall B- or something in the course.
I mean, I thought, well, particularly in physics, but students are told up front that there's 50% failure rate on first year science exams generally. So they kind of have that. They come in being told that and know that. Is that still the case, Katie?
I didn't tell them. And certainly that's like, I mean, my position came out of a departmental review, and we want to battle these high failure rates, especially for these underrepresented populations and things like this. So obviously didn't do it. I mean, we're basically meeting all the past standards, despite making it a little more tricky. But I don't know if maybe it would be helpful to tell them.
So it'd be interesting
these
to
things
find out
from the
why
beginning.
they're failing, whether it's a lack of time, like can they do these problems if they've got another 2 hours? Or is it a lack of knowledge, they've got no hope even if you gave them 10 hours? Or is it, I can
Just
only
like
do
a
this if I've got a
psychological-
group?
Yep.
Or I was freaked out by the different format on the exam. I thought I was okay, I thought I was ready, but actually
So that was going to my question/comment. We had the same problem where we did lots of online quizzes for a start, and then students were finding the paper and pen tests too different from their revision, and they weren't investing in as much thought in working out the problems, because that's not required on the online quiz. You just click and you get the answer or feedback. So we've actually shifted all our revision questions back to paper-based PDFs, and then teamed that up with Piazza discussions for further exploration digitally. But we actually tell students to do everything under test conditions. All their revision should be under test conditions to prepare for the high-stressed
That's a good
exams.
message as well.
So we've gone the other way.
Yeah, we've considered at least switching the weekly
But
quizzes to paper.
my question is, given the team approach and the shift away from the traditional exam, do you envisage somewhere down the line having an exam where it's team based? That's my question. Only certain
Well, I'd say this final exam is very similar to past years, so we have it as a comparison. As you saw by those 5 elements of successful collaborative learning, I think it's essential to have some individual accountability as well as positive interdependence. So I wouldn't switch to an entirely team-based exam, but I think moving in the way that we have, where more of the assessment is done in a team, is positive.
What were we going to say?
We do computer-based exams.
Oh.
Sorry
Yes.
I missed this. How many people did you have in
3.
3?
Yes, which this semester, I mean, well, at NC State, this was a service course for engineering, so we at least had everyone who was in it was qualified in the School of Engineering, so it was a higher performing bunch. You at least had a baseline ability. Here, although the attendance is way higher than the lecture, there's still, especially 120, second half of the year wasn't that high, so this semester we're experimenting with groups of 4.
That'll be the other interesting thing is, are the people down in the 15, 20, 25% mark,
Yeah.
are they the ones not coming to class?
Mhm.
Because I would strongly suspect that is the
Yeah.
case, but it'd be nice to prove that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, you do have a lot of people, like, in-class grades are 30% of the course, so people here, but as I say, those are the concerning people, the ones who do come to class and do the assignments.
Got a question over here.
Mhm.
A couple of quick ones, At what stage did you form the groups? How many weeks they what was your diagnostic for deciding others?
Yeah, that's another thing that's difficult in New Zealand with the shopping period that people take big advantage of. So for the first semester course, we used just their GPE, and we did have a assigned team on day 1, and after shopping period ended, we tried to maintain the groups as much as we could, but just the people who weren't in a team of 3 anymore, just fill those in. For the second semester course, we used their Physics 120 grade.
My next question was about workload in terms of staff.
Mm-hmm.
So, am I right that you needed more staff hours to run it this way than the
No, I don't think so. Well, with the team taught model, I talked to the other professors, and they said because before they'd have to come up with their own lecture material and things like this, there was a ton of prep time, whereas this, they might flip through the slides in 15 minutes, and I essentially prepared all the daily plans and the slides and things like this. So they found that it was pretty comparable to if they were creating their own lectures. But certainly,
100 students as opposed to 300.
yeah, I think, well, even for me, teaching the whole 12, 13 weeks, 6 hours in class is a lot more than just team teaching a section of a course. So
Yeah.
I think that's something people aren't used to for stage 1.
I've got another question. It's a little bit random. It's about the layout of the classroom. I noticed that you had stools.
Mhm.
Not chairs, but high stools and that the desks were high.
Mhm.
This is, so in engineering we've got these new
Mhm.
PTSs, and they've also got that same model. And I hate using them because I'm not a tall person. So I stand up and everyone sitting on the stools is the same height as me, which means I can't see my class.
Okay.
How does this work? Why don't you choose it? Would you do it again? Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Okay. This is a good question. Well, a lot of the reason we kept it at the same height, and we kept those are old stools from when it was the first year lab. So we still have a lot of labs in there. So for that case,
So
we wanted to keep it. And it was cheaper to keep the stools. Our probably number one complaint about the course is those bloody stools, like, which are really uncomfortable. And even we sat there for some classroom meeting types, and after 45 minutes, like, back hurt. I mean, some kids just stand the whole class as well. So I do have at least back stools with backs that as soon as we have enough funding, we're hopefully going to switch out our stools without the back support to at least have the back support. As far as the height and things like this, Well, I was just reading a paper about a similar scale-up thing at another institution, and they said they found that the stools in the higher tables were better than the lower tables in the chairs, but they didn't say why. So.
From a student perspective, it was, if you were wanting to work standing up, it was quite nice to have a table that's at that level, but then that requires a stool that you can sit on.
Was it your section that they sat at the smaller table
it was
there?
like one table that was the lower class table that was a normal height.
Yeah.
Normal chairs. It seemed popular.
So what, because this is very different from what the stage 1 students comes into university expecting, classes to be like. What sort of activities that you've done to actually prep them for this kind of format?
Yes, I think last semester we kind of lectured them how things would have to change, which was not the best approach. So this time, we do a lot of those Socrates space race questions. So for going into the second semester course where maybe a third to a fourth of our students were new, we just had a lot of course information, kind of fun space race things like I should come, or in class I should be like looking through Facebook, or just like fun things to talk about the course while doing this team space race. So they have the rocket ships that go across as well. So more dynamic way to have discussions about what their behavior should be in groups and set expectations for the course. Something we always did at NC State was like a rumors exercise where on the whiteboard they're supposed to talk about what rumors they heard about the course, the professor, and the scale-up style. We couldn't... So a lot of times you get things like the course is hard, great professor, I have to spend a lot of time at home studying, you actually have to read the textbook, things like this. So it's good opportunity to actually address this. Obviously for the first semester doing it here, there were no rumors because no one really knew what it was. So that might be something that we bring back now that there are students who are doing it.
I tried it 1 year. I got the previous cohort to leave one piece of advice they would for the next cohort on Post-its. And I just put that up on the board and that was a treat.
Okay.
Took a photo of it, put it on canvas. And like that.
Well, one of the end semester survey things I did, one of the questions were what advice would you give a future studio student? So I have assembled a list from past studio students and now that's on Canvas for their advice. But it is, I think, I haven't heard of anyone specifically responding to that, but a lot of it's great advice, like you think you don't have to take notes in class, but you need to take notes, or like read the textbook, it's like worth it, and things like this. So I think hearing it from each other does help.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but what an amazing talk. Thank you very much. I was part of a physics class when I first came to university here, where we had those rolling blackboards, and the lecturer pretty much had his back to us the whole time. And so it's amazing to see such innovation happening in the teaching of physics, and it's really inspirational. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And we hope to hear more about the future developments. Hope we can take some of these ideas here in the business schools.
Yeah.
So thank you.